Good evening, everyone. I just wanted to give a couple of updates. Our Wednesday night dollars have been going to LifeWise, which is a program ministry in the public schools where they take the kids out of the school whose parents sign them up, and they get to go eat lunch at a local church, and they get a Bible lesson. And we have some newsletters from the local LifeWise back on the back table if you're interested and to see their updates. They have 137 kids in Fredericktown that go over there. How awesome is that? That's a big number considering Fredericktown is not a huge school. And they have raised over $86,000 already, and their goal is $126,000. So that's really awesome. So if you want more updates, these are on the back table. Don't forget that November 19th is Friends and Family Day, so make sure that you're taking those flyers out on the welcome bar and just pass those out everywhere you go to everyone. We love to print those so you can take them. And don't forget, we're also having a potluck that day right after service. And then you can also mark your calendars for the Christmas play. The 9th, 10th, and 11th, is that right? 8, 9, 10. 8th, 9th, and the 10th of December. So make sure that you come to at least one of those showings. And I think that's all. Oh, I'm sorry. The who? We will have special guest singers this Sunday, the Parsons family. Yes, and the devotions that Pastor wrote for the Thanksgiving season, they start October 24th. They're out on the table in the hallway, so you can grab one of those and do a daily devotion that leads up to Thanksgiving. Is that all? All right, turning it over to Andy.
All right, thanks, Chelsea. And speaking of Fredericktown, congratulations to the Freddie football team. They're going to the playoffs Friday, if you guys didn't know. Pretty cool stuff. All right, so we're going to get right into it. If you didn't get an outline, those have been printed off for you. They're in the back. Just raise your hand. Chelsea will come around and give you one of those outlines. I've got a few of the things mentioned on there we'll talk about. It's a broad outline, so there's only a few scriptures mentioned on there. We'll probably get into a few more. That's just the nature of this thing. But we're going to get right into it because we left off in 1 Kings 20, and as you recall, we had those 2 repulsions by Israel when Syria, or back then what was called Aram, attacked under Ben-Hadad, and he's pushed back. He suffers defeat, and we'll get right into what takes place. But there's a couple things we want to set up first, because if you've sat in these studies long enough, you've understood, just as I've understood, that often God uses war. What's it good for? Well, we know war, or specifically nations, are used sometimes as God's instrument of divine judgment. Now, that starts out initially, we see those examples with Israel. As they come out of Egypt, if you recall, we go even back further in time from our study tonight, and we recall that they're coming out of Egypt. It's the Canaan conquest under Joshua, and they're driving out those Canaanites, and not just the Canaanites, but other groups that were within Canaanite lands, people like the Amalekites, who weren't actually Canaanite, a different group of people, and the reason that God's driving them out. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. How is that relevant to not just our study, but to those current events that we like to really make applicable to our study, to our daily living? It helps us to understand prophecy as well. Well, one of the things that you may be hearing a lot more lately are some of those mantras that you see, particularly from leftists who use terms like occupiers when they talk about Israel. Has anybody heard that term? In the occupation, they call Israel an apartheid state. Getting real fancy. Everybody remembers what apartheid was. Not that it was a good thing. We can do a whole different study on Nelson Mandela, and you guys probably won't like me when it's done, but that's for a different time. Anyway, I'm probably the only person in America that will say that. But the whole point is that they are using these terms very erroneously, just as a doctrine of deception, which we'll also get into tonight. We talked last week about that taqwi, that idea of you are commanded, so to speak, to deceive infidels. Who are the infidels? Well, if you're not Islamic, you're an infidel. That means you and me, everybody in this room. So we discussed that last week, but there are other doctrines and tactics behind this deceit, including what you might see at the bottom of that outline, some of those other terms you'll probably hear from time to time in the news, most particularly that strange word there, hudna. What is that? Well, it's kind of what you see right now, where you have Israel with this response, and now you're seeing the Palestinians, who, by the way, are releasing footage of things like actually carrying mannequins of children, not real children, into the hospital, just try to get the world to sympathize and feel sorry for them. And they're saying, oh, Israel's just beating us just relentlessly, they need to stop. What is hudna? Well, it's that deception again of, okay, we don't want to fight, we're sorry, let's just have peace, let's have a ceasefire. But what the intention really is behind it is that, yes, it's kind of a ceasefire, but it's very temporary. And while we're in this ceasefire, we are going to be rearming, and we're going to be equipping ourselves, and we're going to come back at you. And then if you pummel us back, we'll tell the whole world, we'll tell the United Nations, you might hear me refer to them as United Nothings or the United Nincompoops. Forgive me for the strong language, but they are very anti-Israel, and they'll be the first to condemn Israel for defending herself. I have a real problem with that. So we see some more of that doctrine of deceit that comes out of these practices. What it all boils down to, and what we're really going to hit hard tonight, is, again, this is kind of a continuation. We really didn't get to go as deep as I wanted to last week. There was just way too much to cover. I'm not going to repeat it all or finish the rest of that, because I don't believe, first of all, that it's God's will for us. I think he had other things he wanted us to know tonight. But I really wanted to make sure we understood and didn't forget that idea we talked about last time, that this really boils down to a demonic strategy behind all of it. It is satanic influence that drives anti-Semitism. If you don't know already, anti-Semitism is demonic, period. It's inseparable. When we did our New Age study, we didn't even get to peel back all the layers on that. When we made those connections from those Hindu belief systems and the Yazidi that are connected to that, who still live in the Middle East, who are literally, they're Satanists. It's not somebody like me just saying what they do is satanic. They are unashamed Satanists. And in fact, I worked with somebody that lived among them on his deployment, not by choice. Long story short, they are Satanists. That is what they practice, is this Satanism that's linked later to Hinduism. What do they all have in common? Anti-Semitism. Why is that? Why would these different groups from all over the world have this common hatred of the Jews? It's got to be from a single source. Who's that source? Well, it's Satan. And what we talked about last time was Satan always wants to attack that plan of redemption. He wants to challenge what God has planned for redeeming the world. Where does that redemption start? Where does it culminate? Whose clock is it on? Does everybody remember? Israel. Not America. I know we like to think that everything happens on America's timetable. It's Israel's timetable. Why is that, I wonder? Well, what is, for example, what we might call the center of the universe? Now, I know that when we went to school, they said the sun is the center of the solar system. Everything revolves around that. But I'm thinking a little bit differently here. What is really the center of creation? Jerusalem. And we're going to make a lot of cases to expand on that probably as this study goes on, if the Lord leads. So what we want to talk about first is, when we're looking at those conquests, those early conquests, and that idea that, well, the Israelites, people who are really critical of this, they're going to say, they butchered women and children, they drove out the inhabitants of the land. They don't look back at that earlier history, which we can get into later in this study, maybe with the Table of Nations, and find out exactly who was there first and who was given what. That goes into a much deeper study than we're going to do tonight. But suffice it to say, there is a lot of hypocrisy based on misinformation, much of it intentional. Much of what we talked about last week, the myth of the two-state solution, a total lie, a total propaganda piece, those are all things, the pre-1967 borders, Complete fabrication, total lies, total propaganda, and we're hit with that all the time from the leftist mainstream media. So we see that misinformation, again, always resurfacing. And what's the purpose? To go after Israel. But something very important we must understand, because if you've sat in enough of these studies, then you understand that, yes, we have this situation where God uses the nations as divine judgment. Ultimately, in these studies, we're talking about the prophets, and we're seeing that as judgment against Israel and also Judah after those divided kingdom years. But in the conquest of Canaan, God is using Israel to demonstrate to the nations his judgment, his justice, and his might. And so Israel is in covenant with God at that point. Big difference. So the whole situation changes by the time we get to Ahab. Why does it change? Well, God makes it very clear that his covenant and these blessings and the conquest that they're able to have and the victories they have, there is a stipulation with it. And if we want to go to the next slide, I don't want you to have to look at stuff for too long. If we look at Leviticus 18, for now, we're just going to start in verse 20. Well, I wrote 24, but we really want to start about verse 21. So if that's incorrect on your outlines, forgive me. Leviticus 18:21, and thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Molech, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God. I am the Lord. So a couple different things here. Molech, if you've seen those images in some of your research that you've done, those molten hot hands that they would place the live infant in as human sacrifice. And then, of course, obviously profaning the name of the Lord thy God. Verse 22 says, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination. If you want to just paraphrase that real simple, that's on homosexuality. Verse 23, neither shalt thou lie with any beast to defile thyself therewith, neither shall any woman stand before a beast to lie down thereto. It is confusion. What is that? Bestiality. There, I said it. Verse 24, defile not yourselves in any of these things, for in all these the nations are defiled, which I cast out before you. Now listen to this in verse 25. This is where it gets really interesting. If bestiality and homosexuality wasn't enough, verse 25 says this, and the land is defiled. Therefore I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land itself vomiteth out her inhabitants. If you want to make a whole study out of that with the shedding of blood that we have with Cain and Abel, go ahead, do it on your own sometime. It might be worthwhile. What is the land doing? The land itself wants to throw up. It's vomiting these inhabitants who are what? They're an abomination to God. Verse 26, ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nation, nor any stranger that sojourneth among you. For all these abominations have the men of the land done, which were before you, and the land is defiled. That the land spew not you out also, when you defile it, as it spewed out the nations that were before you. For whosoever shall commit any of these abominations, even the souls that commit them, shall be cut off from among their people. He ends verse 30 saying this, therefore shall ye keep mine ordinance, that ye commit not any one of these abominable customs which were committed before you, and that ye defile not yourselves therein. I am the Lord your God. So this is a unique command. Who's it given to? Directly to Israel. What's interesting about this, there are a couple things, and before we really dive into it in our study, we'll keep in mind that just from an apologetic standpoint, this is a great chapter to know. Why is that? Because unlike other ancient civilizations, what do we see in the chronicling of Israel's history? We see the good, the bad, and the icky, right? We get warts and all. Other empires, historically, archaeologically, the evidence has shown they're going to write about their successes, their wins, their victories, all the good things that kings and emperors did, all the things that their people achieved. However, in the case of Israel, what do we see? We see a lot of grotesque stuff. We see a lot of failures. We see victories, we see successes, we see what happens when you're in covenant with the Lord, but we also see the failures of Israel. And when I say Israel, I'm speaking to encompass Judah and Israel, so don't get confused with, again, those kingdom years that are divided. They have these failures that are listed, the failures of kings, the failures of great men, including King David himself. So we don't try to hide that. If you think back to our Genesis 19 study when we talked about Lot, we compared that difference in the biblical account to the account in the Quran. The Quran doesn't want to mention those ugly little occurrences that happened with Lot. After all, he's a patriarch. The biblical record tells us, on the other hand, guess what? This was problematic, and we're going to talk about it. That's tonight. That's what they say.
I just was thinking about what you said about defiling the land.
Yeah.
And it struck me, this is specific to Israel, God's chosen land, the promised land. It wouldn't apply to other lands, I'm assuming, that because this is God's chosen piece of earth, that's the reason why the land and God would not put up with that sin.
Yeah.
And then one other thought, I was reading through Leviticus and Numbers, and it struck me how God repeatedly told Moses about the tabernacle when he was building it. He would say, it's to be holy. I am the Lord. I am holy. And he kept repeating that to Moses. It is to be holy because I am holy. And he emphasized that over and over.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I think he gets his point across for sure. Those are all great points you bring up as well, sister. Thanks for that input. And so when we consider what she said, yes, there is a special relationship with this unique piece of real estate, this hotly contested real estate about the size of New Jersey, modern day boundaries anyway. It wasn't always that small. King David expanded that to about 300,000 square miles. That's closer to what God originally intended for his people to have. But their disobedience and their lack of staying in covenant with him is ultimately going to cause those borders to change, for that landmass to decrease, or what they had access to those victories being further and fewer between. Excuse me. So that does make a big difference. If we want to go on to our next slide, just so we can catch up a little better than we did last time, we can go right into the main part of our study, and that's finishing chapter 20 of 1 Kings, and we want to look at verse 34, because I think we did leave off there, and this is where Ben-Hadad, who's already been pulverized times 2, and now he's saying, hey, everything that my father took, everything that I've done, I'm going to restore. Why can't we just be friends? And so the last half of that verse is where we're going to pick up tonight, and that's when Ahab says this, and this is going to be a pivotal moment. This is going to change the course of everything. Then said Ahab in verse 34 of 1 Kings 20, I will send thee away with this covenant. So he made a covenant with him and sent him away. Anybody think this is a bad idea? We can probably agree this is a pretty bad idea. Verse 35 goes on to say, and a certain man, the story's going to change a little bit. We're going to go to a different scene here for just a second, but we're in verse 35, and it says this, and a certain man of the sons of the prophets said unto his neighbor, in the word of the Lord, that's important, smite me, I pray thee, and the man refused to smite him. The prophet says, smite me. This guy says, no, I can't do that. I'm not going to do it. No, can't do. Then he said unto him, because thou hast not obeyed the voice of the Lord, behold, as soon as thou art departed from me, a lion shall slay thee. And as soon as he was departed from him, a lion found him and slew him. So this other person, this other man that this prophet went to and said, I need you to smite me, he says, no. He says, you're not doing this for me. I told you to do it for the Lord. The Lord said for you to do this. This guy says, no, he's disobeying not the prophet. He's disobeying the Lord. And so he goes away, and only to be eaten by a lion, of course. So pretty dramatic in and of itself. But the prophet turns to someone else, and he says, he says to this other person, smite me, I pray thee. And the man smote him, so that in smiting he wounded him. So this guy did what he said. Now, most scholars believe that the implication here is that these two different men, one who has now found himself in the belly of a lion, and the other who went ahead and obeyed and smote this prophet. It's believed that the implication is that these are also prophets or sons of the prophet, that they're purposefully disobeying the Lord, knowing that God does do things that are somewhat theatrical, we might say. We've seen that as we've reviewed different things about the prophets over the last few weeks. They can be crazy things, if you didn't know already, things that could be anything from how they position themselves on the street to who they marry to what their occupation might be. All of these grand demonstrations, very dramatic examples that God uses that we might say, well, that seems a little theatrical, but God is making a point. Isn't it interesting that we can look at these things from our perspective and say, well, God knew what he was doing. God sees from outside of time. God has a plan. They should have obeyed. We don't always do that ourselves, though, because it's very hard for us to trust in the Lord and know that he has a plan. Trust the plan. God knows what's going on. He tells you something that you might think is a little bit crazy. That's incredulous. Well, I can't buy that. I don't. Why would you want me to do that? But he knows what he's doing, and it's important for us to obey. And so what happens with this situation, this prophet is now, he's been smitten, so he is wounded. And so what he does, he departs in verse 38, and he waits for the king by the way, disguises himself with ashes on his face. So probably some kind of sackcloth, some kind of bandaging, some kind of ashes, because what does Ahab have a habit of doing? Distancing himself, isolating himself from the prophets. Do you know anybody that doesn't want to come to church, that doesn't want to hear what you have to say about the Lord, that wants to purposely go out of their way to avoid those conversations or a confrontation or an encounter with the Lord? They just don't want it. This is Ahab. He does not want to have this connection with the Lord. He does not want to be confronted by the prophets. It doesn't work out too well for him because he always is disobedient to the Lord. So he doesn't like what the messenger is bringing. So this guy has now disguised himself. And if I didn't lose my place, we'll pick up in verse 39. And as the king passed by, this prophet who's in disguise, he's been wounded, he cries out to the king. He says, thy servant went out in the midst of the battle, and behold, a man turned aside and brought a man unto me and said, keep this man. If by any means he be missing, then shall thy life be for his life, or else thou shalt pay a talent of silver. And as thy servant was busy here and there, he was gone. And the king of Israel said unto him, well, so shall thy judgment be. Thyself hast decided it. So in other words, he's given him this story. He set up this scenario and said, I was in the battle. This is a very likely scenario. You can obviously tell I've been in battle. Look at my wound, look at my bandages. And I didn't keep track of this guy like I was told. And they said it would cost me my life. And I just got kind of busy. You know, life just gets busy. I was busy. And Ahab says, that doesn't fly. Your life or his life. That's how it goes, sucker. And so sucker is a different version, not the King James. So we go on to verse 41. He says, and he hasted. As soon as the king says, and he hasted. So he rapidly takes off whatever he's got on, sackcloth, ashes, wipes off his face, uncovers his eyes. He takes him away, and the king of Israel discerned that he was of the prophets. He's like, ta-da. It's kind of like that moment with Nathan. If you think back to that dramatic story, another example of a prophet being very theatrical, where Nathan goes to David. David is being confronted. He's been in that terrible sin. And what does Nathan do? He tells him this dramatic story, this gut-wrenching story, and draws David right in. Yeah, there are these two guys, and here's what this guy did, and how terrible is this? And he stirs up this righteous indignation in David, and David's like, oh, he's going to pay, why I oughta. And he says, guess what? That man is you. Remember that? That was another like, that's what these prophets like to do. They're like, by the way, it's you. You're the one in trouble. And so that's what this prophet does. Verse 42 says this. He says, thus saith the Lord. Here comes the judgment, the rebuke from God. Thus saith the Lord, because thou hast let go out of thy hand a man whom I appointed to utter destruction, therefore thy life shall go for his life, and thy people for his people. This is a tough pronouncement. Not just your life, but the lives of your people. You have gambled, and it has cost you a nation. That's pretty tough. And the king of Israel, in our final verse, verse 43, and the king of Israel went to his house heavy and displeased and came to Samaria. Displeased. Now, not repentant, notice that. Just this sullen, this sulking, probably just really angry under his breath. This is just like that time with that stinking Elijah, you know, that kind of thing. But not really truly sorry for what he's done. No repentance. He's had this kinship that he feels with this pagan king, Ben-Hadad. Of course, he's a pagan king, so why wouldn't they connect? Now, in Ahab's defense, it could be that we've talked about that looming cloud to the north, Assyria. It could be that maybe, just maybe, Ahab thought, I got to keep this guy as an ally because now we might need to join forces just like in the past. And I do want to be a good student of history and remember that we've had to unite before. We might have to have a united front against Assyria. So maybe he was thinking, I need to keep this ally. If I take him out of the equation, it creates a power vacuum. Who knows who's going to be in there? Maybe that is annexed into the Assyrian Empire, and then are we in trouble? Maybe, just maybe. But if that was the case, I don't think Ahab was trusting in the Lord. It sounds pretty clear he wouldn't have been. He didn't trust in the Lord. He didn't want to listen to what the prophets had to say. So you say, well, maybe another excuse for Ahab could be that he's just being merciful. He's being merciful to Ben-Hadad and that he's not going to kill him. But Elijah, who, by the way, is alive as we speak in this study, if you didn't know, it's kind of a cool thing to think about. If he could come into this sanctuary right now, he could walk through those doors, and you probably wouldn't even recognize him, but he'd be dressed different. And he could come in, and you could say, hey, by the way, was Ahab very merciful? He would be like, yeah, right. Yeah, he was not merciful. That is not a characteristic of Ahab. Nice try. So we don't see mercy displayed in this person. What we see is, again, more disobedience. Not only disobedience, but a flagrant disregard for God's command. Why? Because he had to have heard at some point in his life Leviticus 18. This guy has surrounded himself with elders that have wisdom, elders who fear the Lord. There's still 7,000 in Israel that are faithful to God. Somewhere along the lines, he has to know that Leviticus 18 is a specific command given to Israel. And what does he do? He throws it right in the delete bin on his computer and doesn't ever want to look at it again. So we have a major situation now, not only for Ahab, his reign is going to end, his life is going to end, and the sovereign rule of the people of Israel is going to end. It's pretty dramatic. It's quite a judgment to pronounce. But Ahab didn't want to be a good student of history. He didn't want to remember what happened in Canaan. He didn't want to think about the very land spewing out those who committed these kind of abominations. He didn't like that kind of stuff. He liked his pagan gods. Those felt a little bit nicer. Molech, maybe not so nice, but he didn't like the stuff that the Lord made you do. The requirements of the Lord was just a bridge too far for him, so he didn't like that. Now, interestingly enough, we talk about this disobedience from Ahab. We don't want to forget that disobedience from that possible prophet, or at least that other neighbor, that man that our unnamed prophet went to and said, smite me, because he didn't obey the Lord. There are consequences to obeying the Lord. Likewise, he didn't remember history. He didn't remember the things the Lord had done, including some of those very theatrical things that, and I say theatrical, I don't mean that in a way to disparage or to ridicule. It's certainly not mocking what God does. It might be just the best word we have in our English today in modern usage for what those dramatic things we're doing. God wants me to marry a prostitute to do what? Says one prophet. I mean, some crazy, crazy things. If you're not tracking, there is a story there. It's not just an excuse for me to use the word prostitute from up here. I promise there are reasons that God has these things happening. He always has a reason. Men like Ahab don't want to understand it, don't want to believe it. They don't even want to hear it. So let's go on to our next slide. It's kind of interesting that Ahab, who didn't trust anybody, and I did use a little cartoon there instead of the normal kind of cringy stuff that I tend to use, just to show him kind of coming hat in hand or crown in hand to Ahab, Ben-Hadad that is, just because we want to have a little bit of fun with it. But the problem is that we still have this situation where somebody is being very disobedient. This divine judgment is going to come, and Ahab completely disregards it. When we look at our next slide, a couple pictures I'll explain in just a minute. Obeying God is kind of a big deal, guys. All of us in this room, of course, know that. But when we go back, whether it's the conquest of Canaan or whether it's the failure of Ahab, we see that God's reasons are always there. We just might not recognize it at first. Why did he want to have the Canaanites driven out? Why were these commands to wipe out these people? Well, he realized that there would be this integration, that they wouldn't assimilate to the Hebrew culture. It'd be the other way around, that they would end up having these idolatrous practices, that they would end up being the ones that would influence rather than be influenced. So there's a number of reasons. He also, seeing outside of time, saw the future entanglements that are going to come by these people not being dealt with. What's one of our best examples? Again, we're going to go back just a little bit to some previous kings ahead of Ahab, and we look at the very first king. So we talked about the conquest of Canaan. That's under Joshua. We move up to the time of Judges, and now we're going to move up to our very first king of Israel, King Saul. Everybody remember this guy? A little bit on the temperamental side. And in 1 Samuel 15, he's given a command. He is supposed to exterminate the Amalekites. I just mentioned them a few minutes ago. They weren't Canaanites, but they lived in the Canaan region. And by the way, they had these alliances with the Canaanites. So for years, they are a thorn in the side to Israel. Saul is given the directive by God. He is to wipe them out. Sounds pretty harsh, I get it. But remember, we serve a God who lives outside of time, sees outside of time, knows future events. He tells Saul to wipe them out. Does Saul wipe them out? He does not wipe them out. A little bit of a spoiler for you. In fact, what he does, he not only disobeys God, he lies about it afterwards. Now, this is going to be a major problem. If you go just about 15 chapters ahead in 1 Samuel, you'll find out David's going to endure this raid, this kidnapping. He's going to have to deal with the Amalekites himself. But it gets worse from there, because now we'll fast forward even further into Israel's history. And everybody here knows the book of Esther, right? Everybody's heard of Esther, right? Remember Mordecai and that famous line, for such a time as this? Who was the bad guy in Esther? Haman. To this day, considered one of the worst villains in the history of the Jewish people. They even still, once a year, will make or buy their little Hamantash and shaped like his traditional three-corner hat. Most wicked guy, one of the most wicked guys, like worse than Hitler even, in their history. Who was Haman? Haman's father, he was a Agagite. Well, what does that mean? He is a descendant of Agag. Agag was a king of who? You guessed it, the Amalekites. I realize that's a lot to track. Here's the bottom line. Had King Saul obeyed the Lord and exterminated the Amalekites, David wouldn't have to deal with them. The entire population of Jews, because remember that decree in Esther is worldwide. Every Jew is put in danger in the book of Esther by Haman, a descendant of the Amalekites that should have been wiped out. But Saul disobeyed and lied, and now we have Haman who wants to eradicate the Jews. Again, another demonic strategy, somebody under the influence of Satan who wants to do what? Eliminate the Jewish people. That goes back to our study last week where we talked about why. Because God has a plan of redemption, and it also figures quite prominently into his return and his redemption for the world. Yes, Satan wants to attack Israel. He wants to destroy the Jewish people. So we see that happening throughout history, not just with Ahab, but this disobedience, this weakness that is in Ahab, it's in King Saul. It's in the world leaders today. And I don't care if they're Republican or Democrat. We could do a whole study on that. It doesn't matter if it's Eisenhower or Reagan or Jimmy Carter. Every one of them at some level has betrayed Israel. Trust me when I tell you. If you don't believe me, we'll talk about it after the study. We don't have enough time tonight, so we're going to move on. In fact, we could probably go on to the next slide. I think we're moving. No, I'm sorry. Let's keep it on this one for a second, because I did mention people who are under the influence of Satan. And so this is the part where you guys really want to distance yourself from me. You're free to leave now if you want to. You might recognize a couple of our politicians, because these people that are under the satanic influence still exist in the halls of power today. It did not end with the death of Ben-Hadad. It did not end with the death of Haman or the death of Hitler. It still goes on today. And you say, Andy, are you really comparing some of our Congress people to Adolf Hitler? What I'm telling you is that, remember what I said a minute ago, anti-Semitism is demonic, period. There's no way around it. It is demonic. It is from Satan. So what I'm telling you is it can be twisted any way you like, but the bottom line is the people that you see, like the squad as they call them, that are openly anti-Israel, that are pro-Hamas. The picture on the right is the representative from Michigan, Mrs. Talib, however you say it, who got caught by a Fox reporter, wouldn't answer her comments about beheaded Jewish babies found in Israel after the October 7th attack. The other picture, it's maybe hard to see from where you're sitting, is the infamous AOC, and it says here, AOC on the House floor as Congress passes $1 billion in funding for Israel's Iron Dome. She cries, openly cries. She's got her stupid mask on. That's a different study too, don't get me started. I'm sure she's had COVID 16 times and has 47 boosters. Pastor, I like that you like that she's covered, but losing brain cells, she cannot afford. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm sure they weren't real. But what is real is, again, I can't express it with enough sincerity. People like this are under the influence of the Prince of Darkness, period. Yes.
Not to interrupt you, but real quick, that group in Washington State called Squad,
Yeah.
that to me is like what you were saying, like Sistism, they were on TV supporting Hamas.
Oh, absolutely.
And the government's trying to boot them out.
Absolutely, 100%. They also like to promote those lies, the 1967 border lie, the two-state solution myth or lie or fabrication, whatever you want to call it. We can actually probably go to our next slide. That's only there kind of as a visual because it's kind of where we left off last time. And when we're on the topic of these lies and these myths, it's that idea, just as a recap, that idea that there is a true Palestinian state. Keep in mind, you can't be an occupier, first of all, if you are in a territory that has never had a sovereign reigning power. There's, again, never been a Palestinian king. Now, something we talked about last time, we talked about Palestine and those roots to Palestinae, which was what Hadrian renamed the area. It's the Latin word for Palestine. That's why they call it that today. But that is actually a derogatory term, as you remember, from Philistia, from the Philistines, the ancient enemy of Israel, who by the time Hadrian did that had vanished 600 years earlier. I mentioned that they had come from Crete. They were not Canaanites. They came from Crete. But what I didn't tell you is that there's even more of a backstory to the Philistines or Philistines, depending on which side of the pond you're from. And that story is this. Before they got to Crete, they had to come from somewhere else. And guess where that was? That was Egypt. Egypt to Crete, to the Mediterranean coast of what became Philistia, what is called today Palestine, or what the media likes to call the Gaza Strip. They came originally from Egypt. We can go back even further than that, but for tonight, we'll leave it at that. Where did Yasser Arafat come from? Everybody remembers him, right? Most of us remember him and recognize him as the face of what? Palestine, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, right? The movement to free Palestine. Did you know he was Egyptian? He was Egyptian. So, again, was he a Philistine? I guess technically he was. Had his people been there for a while? Yeah, sure, I guess they had been. But the lie, the myth, the erasing of history, there's a reason statues are toppled and textbooks are changed, because those histories are very inconvenient. Facts tend to get in the way of people like AOC, especially of the left-wing media, of the idiots in Hollywood who don't know anything but want to tell you how to live. And again, I'm sorry to be so coarse when I talk, but they're as big of nincompoops, again, sorry for the profanity, as the United Nincompoops. So in my belief, they all fall under that same satanic influence, some to a more degree than another, others who openly and knowingly serve the Prince of Darkness, others who are just under a strong delusion. What do they all have in common? An anti-Israel agenda. And all of it has to do with God's plan of redemption. Does that affect America? Absolutely it does. Does it affect us in the church as believers? It sure does, because guess who else is part of that plan for redemption? Everyone sitting in this room, everybody probably who has not turned me off by now, part of the plan of redemption that God has for mankind. I had a couple quotes here with this slide, but we're going to move past that because I don't believe that's where the Lord's leading tonight. Apparently he didn't want that out last week either. When we're talking about, if we want to go to the next slide, we're talking about those doctrines of deceit, that misinformation, the misinformed way that Ahab lived. It's still happening today. Once people come under these demonic influences, and when we're talking about demonic influences, we mentioned Daniel 10. We talked about that prince of Persia, that power behind the throne. We still have that same problem happening today. Does anybody here really pray for our leaders? Just a moment. I know I asked you to raise your hand a lot, and I let you out of it a lot, but come on, are we honest? Do we pray for our leaders enough? Me and Ron Jr. pray for our leaders. Thank you, the rest of you, for your honesty. Here's the problem, and I know you do. I'm just giving you a hard time. When we pray for our leaders, do they deserve our prayers? Let's be honest. Does AOC and her stupid mask with her fake tears, does she really deserve our prayers? Let's face it. She probably really doesn't if we look at it from that perspective. But here's the thing. If you are not praying for nincompoops like AOC, who's influencing them? Think back, Daniel 10, I gave you a hint a minute ago. Whose influence do they fall under, I wonder? It's a satanic influence. That satanic influence every time will go after God's redemptive plan. Always. What does that mean? It will always point back to anti-Semitism. It doesn't matter what age. It could be Haman. It could be Hitler. It doesn't matter what age. It could be Hamas. It will always be connected with Lucifer. It's a satanic stratagem. We talked last time not only about the misinformation, but I wanted to give you more information. We talked about Hamas and what that meant. Does everybody remember what Hamas meant? It means something in two different languages. We'll do Arabic first. What does it mean? Anybody? What does Hamas mean in Arabic?
Violence is what I read.
Violence is what it means in Hebrew. In Arabic, it means zeal. Yeah, somebody said it back there. It means zeal, right? In Hebrew, it means something very different. Why does that matter, you say? Well, it matters because clear back to the very beginning of Scripture, we find it throughout Scripture. But clear back in Genesis, we have our first reading of it. If you go to Genesis 6:11, or just write that down, Genesis 6, verse 11, also verse 13. The earth was also corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with Hamas, violence. Clear back in Genesis 6. God said to Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me. The earth is filled with Hamas, violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. What is the destination of people who are filled with violence? What is the end for the person who follows Hamas? Death. That's their destination. I realize it's a dark view, but Scripture gives us this insight all throughout. Now, am I saying, okay, yeah, they're talking about Hamas, the terror organization, in the Bible? I'm not telling you that. What I'm telling you is that what they are intending as some type of rallying cry, the people of God can see this is just a front. They are falling for a trick of Satan. They are following the way of violence. What's interesting is when we talked about that hudna earlier, that deception, one of those things that we see in that deception where they're saying to the world, oh no, they just bombed all these houses in this neighborhood. Look how terrible Israel is. Why did Israel bomb houses? Does anybody have a guess? Now keep in mind, they dropped leaflets before. They said, we're coming from the north. You better get out. Anybody know why they did that? Not many nations do that, by the way. Hamas never sends a warning signal. They dropped them in Arabic so all the people could read it. Hamas blocked them, 175,000-ish civilians trying to escape to safety, because people's lives, they don't mean anything to Hamas, the terror group. That should sound satanic in and of itself. They block them from leaving. Israel bombs those houses, and as they tell the world, look how terrible it is. They even bombed a church. Total lie. But they did bomb houses. You know why they bombed those houses? Because that same terror organization took the millions of dollars in aid that they had received, and instead of helping their people, they used them to build a network of tunnels underground where they store munitions, rockets, and men. They believe maybe up to about 14,000 Hamas terrorists hiding in those tunnels now, accessed through these homes. Hudna, taqwa, these doctrines of deception, so they can tell the world they're bombing our neighborhoods. We can't have a nice neighborhood because of Israel. Look how nasty they are. Not telling the world that, yeah, they're using the heavier bombs now that the houses are out of the way to destroy those tunnels that they're digging into Israel, that they're using to supply munitions and store their rockets. They don't tell the world that part. Pretty disgusting. Interestingly enough, we don't want to make too much of a spiritual thing out of this, but listen to this, Psalm 74:20. The habitations of Hamas are called the dark places of the earth. The habitations of violence, habitations of Hamas. Sounds a lot like tunnels, but I'm not making that spiritual connection. I just want you to understand that God is not fooled by this, and neither should the people of God be. Unfortunately, Ahab was. Let's go to our next slide because we're going to end with just a couple examples of the foolery that's taking place, more of the deception. You may recall a number of times I've mentioned a group called BLM, and I'm not a big fan. They're a Marxist and an occult organization. And this is not me being some Trump-voting evangelical up here saying that BLM is bad. I'm telling you that they proudly say what their goals are. They want to destroy the family. They embrace Marxism, and their founders are occultists or necromancers. That's a fact. You can look it up. You can fact check me on that. I don't have a problem with that. I encourage it. Recently, they released this. Anybody see this larger image on the left in the last 7, maybe 10 days? Is this new to anybody? This is one of BLM's new propaganda pieces, I Stand with Palestine. And if you notice, what's it an image of? Anybody know how the October 7th attack was carried out at the festival? Paragliders. It was an air assault by Hamas. This has nothing to do with innocent people, with innocent civilians. This is a organization, an occultist and Marxist organization who has made it clear they want to destroy the family, who supports this. In fact, they even drew the little yellow harnesses. And if you saw the same clip I did, you may have seen where they went to that music festival. And the group that went in to recover bodies and to check those cars, the one person was a reporter. She couldn't hold it together. They've got her in her flak vest. They got a helmet on her. And as she's going through looking at this stuff, she picks up one of those harnesses off the ground. I don't know if that was staged for the camera, but it was there. Whether she really did find it at that moment, I couldn't tell you. But that yellow harness that they used as part of that gear to come in. And here BLM says, yeah, we stand with them. BLM stands with Hamas, is what they're saying. Why is that such a problem? Well, Andy, you're just politically opposed to that group. Maybe you're a racist, just like the rest of Christians, right? Completely false. If you didn't know, Black Lives Matter has never been about minority lives. In fact, that's why they're in a bunch of trouble for the money scheme that they're in with the purchase of mansions for their owners. They don't care about black lives. What I'm opposed to are people under the influence of Satan carrying out his agenda. And they influence people into believing this. In fact, we can probably go to the next slide. Well, actually, let me read this to you. I know we're running short on time here, but part of this article, I do try to keep a fair and balanced view here, so I'll report, you decide. How's that? Let's do this. This came out of an NBC article. What was once a place of music and dancing was deathly silent, but bar the odd rumble of artillery in the distance. And it says this: on Thursday, in the vast field in southern Israel, where thousands had gathered for the open-air Tribe of Nova festival, half-empty bottles of vodka lined the main bar. Flies circled above, and sandals lay in the grass, the only remnants of fleeing concert-goers. The cars, some of them bullet-ridden, were packed with the essentials: tents, sleeping bags, crates of beer. A few were now marked with the letter X, signifying they had been checked for explosives. The site near the Gaza border was flooded with Israeli combat troops, many of them paratroopers. One of them, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, says this: "This is a massacre." That spokesman, he's a spokesman for the IDF. Surveying the scene where the non-governmental rescue agency Zaka was recovering bodies, they said 260 people had been killed. Hagari must be a good student of history, because listen to what he says. He says this: "It looks like something from World War II. Not since the days of the Einsatzgruppen of the Nazi SS has this type of thing happened." 260 people, not just killed, raped, abducted, tortured. think we all should be good students of history. It's a far cry from video posted, the article goes on to say, on social media before the incursion, which showed young people dancing, now listen to this, to trance music under a giant Buddha statue and prayer flags. People had come to the event to hear music, to do love. They wanted to live, Hagari said. Listen to that again. Dancing to trance music under a giant Buddha statue and prayer flags. Now, before I go any further, I want to make it clear. You all know me, you know I'm very pro-Israel, and I know this church is pro-Israel. I'm sure that I'm probably, my wife and I are the only couple in the neighborhood that have an Israeli flag that we're not afraid to fly. We are pro-Israel. It doesn't mean I agree with their politics all the time. They have leftists in their government just like we have leftists in our government. They make mistakes. The majority of Israelis are secular. Many of them are atheists. There are things that I would like to see happen for Israel so they're back in covenant with God. Israel is also a major supplier of abortions. I don't agree with abortion. All of you know that already. I don't have time to go over the statistics, but we'll sum it up with this. The sources that I cite from a research study done in January cites the statistics of those abortion services rising dramatically since the 1980s, including in 2020 during the so-called pandemic. There are parallels between modern Israel and ancient Israel. None of those young people deserved what happened to them at that festival. The barbarians and their Bronze Age tactics were demonic. What I'm saying is the parallels that exist, the way God uses nations as divine judgment on the nation that is not keeping his commandments, that is not remembering Leviticus 18. Why is it any different than the way Ahab served his pagan god Baal versus dancing under a Buddha statue? It is a paganism. There is a judgment to come. Now, I support Israel 100%. What worries me for Israel is that they still are not in covenant with the Lord, and it reminds me terribly of the United States of America. Abortions here far exceed the abortions in Israel, obviously. Neo-paganism outpaces every other country in the world in its rise right here in America. God will have judgment. I am a decent student of history, and I believe that that judgment will come just like we saw in the times past, and that we're working very steadily up to that point. So our next slide, and we're going to kind of wrap it up here. Obviously, with those concerns, with that deceit that we want to be very mindful of, let's just back it up one more if we can. Just a little thing, because again, the churches that were unfurling those flags from their porticos, those BLM flags and those rainbow flags, I say shame on them, that they are apostate churches. I've said it before, I'll say it again tonight. They are apostate churches. It wasn't good enough that they knew it was a Marxist organization. It wasn't good enough that they knew they were an occultist organization. Now they are admittedly a pro-Hamas organization. Shame on the apostate churches that fly those BLM flags. This little cartoon, because everything was so heavy tonight, I thought I'd cheer you up with a little depiction of beheading. What this cartoon shows is that by the time you realize that you shouldn't have trusted this enemy, it's too late. The man in the mask, obviously representing Hamas or Hezbollah or ISIS, take your pick. It's all the same servants of Satan, but it's too late. So a little dark humor for you there, and then we can end on our last slide because, again, we said this last time, don't mess with Israel. It is the apple of God's eye. Don't mess with Israel. He's going to have a real problem with that. He's also got some very dire consequences that he speaks implicitly to people who attack Israel, to people who love Hamas, who engage in violence. And we can find those later. If we want to talk about that after the service, we can talk about where you can find those references. What is their end? Their end is always in destruction. So as we leave here tonight, I wanted you to be informed. Your outline has some new terms on it that you may hear. wanted to just kind of keep everybody updated, tie that into Scripture, tie that into how we apply it in our lives, and make everybody aware. And also another reminder, pray for our leaders. They don't deserve it. Our politicians are the worst, but we have to pray for them. If we don't, their influence comes from somewhere else, and that's what we were talking about tonight. So keep them in your prayers. Also, make sure you're praying for anybody that's been added to our sick list roster. I know there's a number of people. I've got a friend who has a lesion that has shown up on his kidney. He's very concerned about that. Make sure you keep him in your prayers. I'll just tell you his name's Dan, so pray for Dan. If there's anybody else that we need to throw out there, make sure you speak up now. Otherwise, you should be digging for those dollars for that awesome program Chelsea talked about, that Lifeway program. And Brother Go, did you have something back there?
Who is it? Don Mann
Don Mann.
has had a heart attack.
I know Don.
He had a heart.
Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. He's related to my son. All right, so I'll talk to you maybe after church about that. So keep Don Mann in your prayers. He's in the hospital in Marion. And if it's the same Don Mann we're talking about, he is a believer. So he's in a good place regardless. He's not real worried about Don. God is good. So, all right, bring up those dollars, and if there's no more questions, we'll close out. In the meantime, remember to love each other, and Lord willing, I'll see you on Sunday.